Welcome to another philosophy video. In this video, I'm going to explain moral relativism. Moral relativism should not be confused with moral subjectivism, which is related to it, but moral subjectivism is the doctrine that says that right, wrong, good, evil, all these moral values depend on the individual. On the other hand, moral relativism refers to the doctrine according to which morality is relative to a culture. There are some individuals who believe that moral judgments are true or false. If you recall from my previous lectures, these are known as cognitivists. They argue that moral judgments are true or false. For example, if I say abortion is right or slavery is wrong, according to a cognitivist, such judgments are true or false. What makes a judgment true or false? According to some, what makes a judgment true or false is the existence of moral properties. Now, these moral properties, some thinkers believe that they are natural. They belong to the natural world. For example, roundness or hardness. These are properties that they exist in the world. Other thinkers, however, think that these moral properties do not exist in nature, in the world. They are supernatural. They belong to a different realm of existence, outside space and time. On the other side, there are those who believe that moral properties do not exist. But if moral properties do not exist, why are moral judgments true or false? What makes them true or false? The answer is, according to moral relativism, for example, is that right, wrong, good, evil, any moral truth that exists is true or false relative to a culture. So it's the relativity of morality is what explains the truth or falsity of moral judgments. It's very similar to personal taste. If I say, for example, that chocolate is the best food in the world, and you ask me, but do you think that's true? I will answer yes, I think it's true. But it's not true universally, objectively, from the point of view of the universe. It's only true for me. Okay? And this is how moral relativists explain why moral judgments are either true or false. Now, relativism says that moral statements can be true or false, as I said, but they are relatively true or false. Relativism does not deny moral rules, moral values. Rather, it asserts that values and rules and morality in general are relative. Morality is a human invention, and it exists only inside a culture. Outside the culture, relativism says morality has no meaning. Consequently, it seems that one principle that is important to relativism is the concept of tolerance, that we are not morally superior to others. Or to be more specific, if relativism is the doctrine according to which right and wrong, morality in general, morals are relative to a culture, according to relativism, no culture in the world or in the universe is morally superior or inferior to any other culture. Why is that? That's because relativists argue that there's no ultimate standard of morality. There's no ultimate answer to any moral question, except for the answer that the culture provides for that question. Morals are like motion or velocity. If you think about Earth around the equator, it rotates at approximately 1,000 miles per hour. But we don't feel it. Right now, I'm sitting at my desk and I'm not moving. Certainly, I'm not going 1,000 miles per hour. But the Milky Way goes even faster. It's 1.3 million miles per hour. If you were to ask, but give me an answer, which one is the correct speed? Which one is the true speed? A relativist, Einstein, for example, who proposed relativity, would say that such a question is a ill-conceived question. I can tell you the correct speed, the true speed or motion, but only relative to something. Because, as Einstein pointed out, there's no universal point of view of velocity or motion. It's relative. Here's another interesting story. There are two civilizations, two cultures, the Galatians and the Greeks, ancient Greeks. Galatians eat their dead. They're dead. Ancient Greeks cremated their dead. Consequently, it would seem that if you asked the Greeks, they would probably say, not probably, they would definitely say that the practice of eating dead people, practice that implemented by the Galatians, is immoral. Vice versa, asking the Galatians, they would answer that the practice that the Greeks use to cremate their dead is immoral. So one might conclude from this experiment and many other experiments of this nature, that morality is relative. Why? Because who's right, the Galatians or the Greeks? Well, there's no possible way to answer that question, relativism says, because how could you possibly answer that question? You would have to have some moral standards according to which burning a dead body is either good or bad, or moral or immoral. The problem is, where are you going to find that rule, that standard? Certainly religious people have different religious texts. For example, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran. And these books can say different things about different practices. But which one is the book that says the truth? If you ask Christians, they would say the Bible. If you ask Muslims, they would say the Quran. So there's no ultimate way of determining who's right and who's wrong. There are many other thought experiments that you can conduct. That you can think of the fact that in many different parts of the world, they perform practices that might seem immoral to us. For example, cannibalism, or promiscuity, or adultery, or you name it, incest. The bottom line is that people observe the variety of views on morals, and they conclude that morals are just relative. They're just like taste, just like personal taste. To give you an example, in Italy, which is my country of birth, if you walk around some certain towns, you'll find butcher shops that sell horse meat. Clearly, you're not going to find it here in the States because it's viewed, it's not immoral, but it's viewed as weird, strange, peculiar. Who would eat a horse? But it's perfectly normal for some Italians to eat horse meat. Now, that's a matter of taste. Italians can say, I like it. American people can respond with disgust and say, this is disgusting. I'll never eat it. Well, taste is taste. Taste is personal. And that's pretty much the way that relativism treats morality. Morality is just like taste, because there's nothing more than taste. You see, there's ultimate answers to mathematics, for example, geometry, or any other empirical science. But when it comes to morals, when it comes to right, wrong, good, bad, evil, what kind of experiment could we possibly conduct that will reveal to us whether a practice or an action is right or wrong? That's the difficulty. However, I wanted to say the following. We should really ponder whether such differences that we might find among the different cultures in the world, whether such differences imply that morality is relative? Well, it seems to me that such differences do not imply that morals are invented. It only implies that people have different moral beliefs. That's the only logical conclusion that we can reach. For example, in the case of the Galatians and the Greeks, the Galatians believed that their dead would continue living when ingested. On the other hand, the Greeks believed that flesh could be corrupted, and so they would cremate their dead. So as you can see, there's no, at bottom, there's no different value, moral value, but it's the belief that changes. Another example is abortion. Now, everyone agrees that murder is wrong. The difference is that the people who are for abortion, the pro-choice, they don't believe that it's murder because typically they believe that the fetus is not a person, is not something that can be wronged. Consequently, it's not a case of murder. On the other hand, the pro-life, those who are against abortion, argue precisely that an abortion of a fetus is murder because it's a human life. As a matter of fact, some of them argue that when the sperm and the egg form a zygote, the zygote is a human being, it's a person, and it deserves a right to life. So my point is that the variation in moral beliefs among the world's cultures does not lead to the conclusion that morality is relative. It only leads to the conclusion that different people view morality differently. However, many people are not convinced by this simple explanation, and they persist and insist that morality is relative. So in the following slides, I would like to show you some of the implications of relativism. The purpose of my showing you these implications is to demonstrate that there is something intrinsically inconsistent about relativism. And if a doctrine or a theory is internally inconsistent or absurd, must be rejected as false. Let me talk about the first point. The first point is that it's not possible for something to be and not to be at the same time. Now, for example, think about the giraffe is taller than the monkey. But the giraffe cannot be taller than the monkey and at the same time shorter than the monkey. But moral relativism argues that an act or an action is right and wrong at the same time. Okay, because it's relative, then something can be right and wrong at the same time. But nothing is right or wrong at the same time. There might be some aspects of an action that are right, while other aspects might be wrong. But I'm talking about on the whole. On the whole, ultimately, an action cannot be right and wrong at the same time. And because this is precisely what relativism argues, we must conclude that relativism must be false. Now, take the second point. Relativism asserts that ultimately the Nazis or the slave owners were not immoral. Think about it. If you are a relativist, if you endorse relativism, by the very definition of relativism, you cannot argue that something is ultimately wrong or ultimately right, because these are the very things that relativism denies. Relativism is the denial of objective, ultimate moral truths. But if you're like me, you would think this is just absurd. The slave owners were immoral, any way you slice it. The Nazis were immoral. The Holocaust was wrong, but not a matter of taste, just like I say to you, I like bananas, and you don't. No. I don't care what you like and you don't like. The Nazis did something absolutely wrong and ultimately wrong, full stop. Now think about it again. If you endorse relativism, you cannot say that the Nazis were ultimately wrong. The only statement that you can make, that you are allowed to make, to be consistent with relativism, is that the Nazis did something that you don't like or your culture doesn't like. But were they wrong? Did they do something immoral? Well, only relative to your culture, but not ultimately immoral. I think this is clearly absurd. And if you're like me, then you will recognize that moral relativism must be false. Furthermore, the next point is this. Think about people like Nannie Helen Burroughs, Martin Luther King Jr. Think of your favorite moral reformer, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, you name it. According to relativism, these people, these individuals who fought segregation and slavery, they should not be praised according to relativism. They should be condemned because, according to relativism, right and wrong are decided by the culture. If you do something that goes against the value of a culture, then you are doing something morally wrong relative to that culture. Now, when you think about the people who fought segregation and slavery, like Martin Luther King Jr., what was Martin Luther King Jr. doing? He was fighting against the status quo. He was fighting the status quo. He was going against the rules and the values of his culture. Consequently, according to relativism, we cannot praise him, but we have to condemn him. We have to regard him and people like him as immoral individuals. Once again, this is clearly absurd. Well, let me talk about the next point. According to, and the next point to me is possibly the most egregious mistake and the clearest illustration that moral relativism is false. Relativism implies that moral progress is impossible. Now, moral progress implies the existence of an ideal. If something is awful, it can improve and become really bad, or it can get better, it can be good. All these stages are better or worse. But better or worse implies the possibility of an ideal, a best or a worst. So moral progress implies the existence of an ideal or ideals. Moral relativism, however, denies ideals. There is no best. So moral relativism denies moral progress. But how could you possibly deny moral progress when moral progress is so evident that we don't even need to run an argument to defend it? Do you think, morally speaking, the world is better today, or it was better when slavery existed? Do you think the world is, morally speaking, better today, that women are allowed to vote, or back then when women were not allowed to vote? Is freedom better than enslavement? Well, if you're like me, you will probably say, of course, the world is better today. It's not the best, but there has occurred moral progress. Now we're much, much better than we were 100 years ago, for example. But then, if moral progress is real, as I think it is, it follows that moral relativism is false. Now, let me talk about the next point. Relativism says what? Right and wrong are decided by the culture. So, the culture determines morals. But here's the problem. The concept of culture is very vague. And to which culture do you belong? So because relativism is vague, there's no social group. And therefore, relativism is false. It's not only false, but it's vague. It's not even a doctrine that says anything. It says relativism, it says morals are decided by a culture. But what is a culture? Think about, for example, the American culture. What is the American culture? How would you define the American culture? Except for people who live in the United States. But what about those Americans who don't live in the United States? Well, they might be part of a different culture. So is culture just geographical? It seems to me that it's very vague what a culture is. What is it exactly characteristic or fundamental about the American culture? That we eat cheeseburgers? That we drink Coca-Cola? Well, a lot of people do that. What exactly is a culture? If you can answer this question I would greatly appreciate it. The next point is tolerance. As I pointed out earlier, if you are a relativist and you endorse the belief that, or the doctrine that no culture is superior or inferior to other cultures, morally speaking, then you must be tolerant of other cultures by definition. But if tolerance is an objective principle, then relativism is false, because according to relativism, no objective moral values or principles exist. And if tolerance exists, it must be universal, it must be objective. But that's the very thing that relativism denies. So relativism cannot be tolerant. Now, I hope that was clear. So in the following slides, I will present two different views. The view of Park Sung-bae, who wrote the article that I assigned, Defense of Cultural Relativism, and my response, my article titled The Incoherence of Moral Relativism. So let me go over each point. Let's start with the principle of tolerance. If you remember my last point, I said that tolerance is an objective value, but relativism cannot afford it, because relativism is the doctrine that denies objective moral value. So, what's the response here? Professor Park has a very clever response. He says, a tolerant act is moral in reference to a culture that agrees with it, immoral in reference to another that disagrees with it. In other words, according to Professor Park, tolerance is relative. Now, my problem is that to say that tolerance is relative, it means that tolerance is not, there's no tolerance at all. Because tolerance is only a matter of taste. But maybe it's possible, but first of all, to begin with, it would be very peculiar that a relativist goes around saying that he is not morally superior or inferior to any other cultures, or his culture is neither superior nor inferior. But at the same time, he or she takes tolerance as a relative value. That's very strange. Now, relativism can accept tolerance as objective, as I said, and this contradicts or rather denies relativism. The other alternative is the alternative that Professor Park takes, that relativism doesn't exist, really. It's merely, not that it doesn't exist, but that it doesn't exist objectively, but it exists only as a matter of taste, okay, relative. The problem is that the other option is that relativism accepts tolerance as relative, but this leads to subjectivism. Now, moral subjectivism is to me, seriously problematic. Now, I want to make a point against relativism and subjectivism. So, the point that I'm going to make applies to both subjectivism and relativism. Subjectivism is the idea that right and wrong is what I say. So if I say that something is wrong, it is wrong. Is it true? Well, it's true for me. But here's a problem. Is moral subjectivism true? Namely, is it true that morality is subjective? What will be the answer? You can ask the moral relativist. Same question. Is moral relativism true? That is to say, is it true that morality is objective? Well, the relativist would have to say, yes, it is true. But true how? Subjectively true or objectively true? Now, if the relativist says, well, it's an objective truth that morality is subjective, you see where the problem is. Because relativism, by definition, denies objectivity and morality. Okay. What if the subjectivist says, or relativist answers, no, it's merely subjective, like in this case? Well, if relativism is subjective, it means that relativism is not true by definition. It's not objectively true. It's not ultimately true. And if it's not ultimately true, then, well, it's just a personal taste. It's not true. And what exactly is the doctrine of relativism? The doctrine of relativism is something that says, hey, morality is relative, but even the statement that I just made is not true. Now, think about it. I'll leave it at that, and you think about it, and you tell me if you get it and what do you think about such a criticism. But let me move to the next point. If you recall, I argue that some values are objectively true. For example, torturing innocent people for fun is always wrong. What the slave owners did is always wrong. Whether you live on the moon, whether you live on Mars, whether it's summer, whether it's August, whatever. Torturing innocent people for fun is wrong. Hitler was wrong. The Holocaust was wrong. Generosity is good. What does Park say about these moral values, these statements? Professor Park says it is possible. Now notice it's interesting that Professor Park defends moral relativism. He is a relativist. And I find it very peculiar that he chooses the language of possibility. It seems to me he should say that the reason why torturing innocent people for fun is always wrong is because all the cultures in the world jointly endorse such values. But he doesn't say that. No, instead he says it is possible that all cultures in the world jointly endorse such values. Which seems to me we can end the conversation here, because if you are open to the possibility, what does that mean? It implies, it entails that if you think it's just possible, well, then it could be possible that at the same time, it could be possible that moral values are objective. It could be possible that torturing innocent people for fun is always wrong because it is always wrong, in fact. So I don't know. I don't think it's the right language. If he defends relativism, he should not say it's possible. In any case, however, here's my rebuttal. How does Professor Park propose to explain such a unanimous endorsement of values? Now, remember that there's no culture in the world, as far as to the best of my knowledge, no culture in the world that says that torturing innocent people for fun is right. All cultures in the world deny this. All cultures in the world condemn torturing innocent people for fun. Now, how do you explain this? What is the best explanation? When Professor Park says that it's possible that all cultures just jointly endorse these values, to my ears, it sounds as if Professor Park is saying that it could be an accident. But it doesn't seem to me that it's an accident. It doesn't seem to me that people, cultures all over the world think that it is immoral to torture innocent people for fun. Not because it's an accident, not because they wake up in the morning and they say, well, maybe today I'm going to uphold a certain value according to which we shouldn't torture people for fun. That's not the way it works. In fact, it would be impossible to conceive the opposite. So, when I ask, what is the best explanation? What is the best explanation that of the unanimous consent that all cultures in the world, according to all cultures in the world, torturing innocent people for fun is just wrong? What's the best explanation? Accident? In my view, the best explanation, the most plausible explanation, is objectivity. Namely, that there's something intrinsically wrong about torturing innocent people. Now, let's look at the next point. Here's very interesting. Hitler was either right or wrong, either good or evil, but not both. Strangely enough, Professor Park bites the bullet and says, no, Hitler was right depending on the moral framework from which we evaluate his actions. So, my response is this. If Hitler is morally right and morally wrong, depending on the framework. Now, for example, from the moral framework of most sensible people, intelligent people, Hitler was wrong. He was immoral. He did something immoral and evil. Now, if Hitler is morally right from some point of reference, which reference frame would that be? Now, would that be Hitler's reference frame? Professor Park might say, yes, from the point of view of Hitler, Hitler was doing the right thing, so from his point of view is right. Now, the problem is that the reference frame of Hitler is the reference frame of a deranged man. And this is not an attack to the person. It's not a logical fallacy. I'm just going by what many books written on Hitler, many psychologists just say Hitler did what he did because he was a deranged man. So would that be morality? Morality would be, according to Park, then relative to the frame of reference of these individuals, deranged, crazy individuals. I don't think it works. What about morality being, what Hitler's actions being right from the point of view of Nazi soldiers? The problem is that many Nazi soldiers disagree with Hitler's policy. Many soldiers disobeyed. Or other soldiers just blindly obeyed the orders because they thought that they were just obeying orders. So where is the frame of reference? Which is the frame of reference that makes Hitler's actions right? Well, at best, it could be Hitler's, but this would be the frame of reference of a deranged individual. And why should we believe that the frame of reference of a deranged individual is right because he or she thinks it's right? Now, the next point. Social reformers and moral progress. Remember that, according to relativism, all moral reformers were wrong, which I think is absurd. And also, according to relativism, moral progress is impossible. But as I pointed out in my presentation, moral progress is clear and evident. Professor Park says, moral reformers are right because you judge from a certain, once again, frame of reference. Now, he says from the current culture, they were right, and from past culture, wrong. And he says about moral progress, there's also relative. We say that equality is better than slavery because we judge from our present frame of reference. Now, the first point that I wanted to respond is, what exactly are the past culture and the present culture? When does one end and the other one begin? Is it really plausible to say that it's a different culture, or it's the same culture, the same people who learned from their mistakes? The second point I wanted to make is it really true that equality is better just from the present culture? I don't think it's true. I think it's false. How do you explain the pervasive trend toward liberalization? And this is throughout history. Now, equality is not just better from the present culture, because even the past culture, many past cultures believe that equality was right within the same culture. The very people who were discriminated against, that were part of that culture, believed that it was wrong. So either this is too vague or it's just plain false, and relativism is false. Now, once again, in my view, is that the best explanation is that humanity is becoming increasingly liberal. And you see it throughout history. All civilizations, all cultures in the world, they they're not moving in any other direction, but they're moving in a direction of liberalism, because it seems to me that liberalism and freedom, okay, are values that are good in themselves. They are intrinsically good, and therefore that is what makes them objective and right to be liberal rather than to enslave people. Now, what about... Oh, wait a minute. Did I... Oh, moral progress. Yes. He says that moral progress is relative. I skipped that point. We say that equality is better. Okay. Yeah, I guess I covered that point already, because even moral progress, I think it's hard. It's much harder to deny moral progress than to affirm that moral progress is just an illusion. How would you call the progress except for progress? Think about it. You go from slavery to freedom. How could you possibly say that it's not clear moral progress, but it's just an illusion? It's just something different. Well, it's more than something different. It is morally different, and I think it's to deny moral progress. It's as hard, as difficult as it is to deny that the existence of a physical world and other people and other individuals in the world. Sure, it might be the case that we are in the Matrix, but, well, the existence of the world has more evidence than the existence of the Matrix. And similarly here, the existence of moral progress, it's so evident that any argument against it is just very weak. So now let's go back to the next point. Can an act be right and wrong at the same time? Professor Park says morality is like motion. Okay? A body is both at rest and in motion, depending on which frame of reference we measure its state. Well, it's not exactly correct, because yes, a body is at rest, but relative to something, and in motion relative to something. So it's not both things at the same time. Either a body is moving or a body is not moving. But wait a minute. Now, Einstein says, no, you're wrong. Because that's the very point of relativity. A body is moving relative to something. A body is not moving relative to something. You cannot tell. There's no ultimate truth about that. Well, my problem is this. I have 3 points. First point is, everything moves in the universe. Okay? Now, remember that Professor Park uses the analogy of motion to represent moral value. Now, he says because motion is relative, then moral value is relative. But the point of relativity is that the relativity of motion is local. Okay? It's not universal. Because the point is that everything in the universe moves. There's no one particle or thing or object in the universe that is completely at rest. If you can find one, please let me know. Write a comment. What is completely at rest, motionless in the universe? It seems to me that nothing is at rest. So if nothing is at rest and everything moves, then his analogy breaks down, because if motion is supposed to be the analog to moral value and everything is in motion, motion does exist ultimately, then it would follow that moral value does exist ultimately. The second point is, even if we take his argument that morality is like motion, Professor Park does not offer any argument whatsoever to support the belief that morality is exactly like motion. He's just asserting that. And my third point is that when we measure motion, it is true we do it relatively, relative to a frame of reference. So our way of measuring motion is different. But just because we measure things differently, it doesn't follow from the variation in measurement that there's no ultimate truth about something. And so it seems to me that his argument ultimately shows only that people in the world believe in different morals. But it doesn't follow, once again, it doesn't follow that morals are relative just because people believe that they are. Furthermore, as I pointed out, the concept of culture is vague. Professor Park says any number of people is sufficient to make a culture. Even 2 people can make a culture. Now, I have 3 points in response. Can we believe that 1 person or 2 people or 3 make a culture? Obviously, Professor Park can say yes. He does say that. I don't believe that a person can be a culture. A person is a person. But even so, who is supposed to decide what a culture is? Well, a culture is decided by Professor Park, perhaps? Well, this goes back to moral subjectivism. It seems to boil down to I, myself, can say that I am a culture. I constitute a culture. And that would be moral subjectivism. It would be the doctrine that says, if I say that something is right, it is right. If I say that something is wrong, it is wrong. Now, ask me, is that true? Well, yes, it's true, but in a relative way. And so it's not even true that moral subjectivism is true. Now, the second point is, just because some people have different views, and I said this point many, many times, does not prove that morality is not objective. Who decides the culture? That's a big problem. So it seems to me the bottom line, the point that I'm trying to make is that either you accept that the culture can be a person, but even in that case, you would have to ask, who decides that? That person? Why should we believe that person? Or you believe that, or you come to the same conclusion that I come to, which is that the concept of a culture is just vague. Now, Professor Park, in his paper, uses an interesting example. The example of a woman, a pregnant woman called Mary. She is an American citizen, Professor Parks tells us, and a Christian. Now, she contemplates abortion, but what is she supposed to do? Now, Professor Parks says if she's interested in the American culture, then she should get an abortion because the American law condones it. I think he made a mistake. He should not have said the American law because we're not talking about law. We're talking about morality. But in any case, let's apply, let's read his argument in the best way possible. The American law, so morality, the American culture condones it, okay? But Christianity prohibits it. Now, Mary's abortion, he says, is moral in relation to the American culture, but it is immoral in relation to the Christian culture. This is what Professor Park says on page 165. Now, Professor Park argues that it is up to Mary to decide by which culture to abide. Now, here's my response. Suppose that Mary is interested in her future as an American. Does that answer the question, does that help Mary determine whether to get an abortion? Well, according to Professor Park, remember he says Mary's abortion is moral in relation to the American culture. But let me ask Professor Park, abortion is moral according to the American culture, but which part of the American culture? Because the American culture is divided. As a matter of fact, there are people who are for abortion, there are people who are against abortion, there are people who are on the fence, there are people who just don't know what to think, there are people who are for and against at the same time, there are people who say if it's incest or a rape, then abortion is okay, there are other people who say no. So exactly which part of the American culture, to which part of the American culture is Professor Park referring? And to which aspect of the American culture should Mary refer? You see, so it's just Professor Park tries to bite the bullet and say, well, it's not a problem because it's up to you. It's up to which culture you want to follow. Now, suppose that Professor Park says, well, remember what I said? That a culture can be one person. Okay, well then ask yourself, you're Mary. Ask yourself, Mary, which is my culture? Am I for or against abortion? And how are you going to get the answer? Except for you flip a coin. Is that what moral relativism advocates? Now, furthermore, consider that the majority religion in the United States is Christianity. 70.6%. Now, wouldn't that entail that being a Christian is, in fact, a very aspect of the American culture? And as a matter of fact, there are many Christians who are for abortion. There are many Christians who are against abortion. So, as you can see from my discussion, I want to make a conclusion. My conclusion is that my arguments seem to me sound. In my view, there are many moral values, there are many things that are morally right and many things that are morally wrong, independently of what we think. Okay? Culture has nothing to do with it. There's no evidence that morals are relative. The only evidence we have is that people have different beliefs. That doesn't prove squat, as they say. I think that all the counter arguments that Professor Park presents are fallacious. Now, I want to leave you with this, with my final thought. Even if you think that I am wrong and Professor Park is right somehow, think about it. If you don't think that moral relativism is internally inconsistent, it's an incoherent view, think about it. Moral relativism is completely impractical because, as I demonstrated, there's no possible way for a relativist to make moral decisions. If you have to go by your culture, if you have to ask yourself, what does my culture think? Now think about it. Think about it. If you're watching this video from the United States, or if you're watching this video from Europe or Asia, just think about it. What does your culture say about cloning, abortion, right? The capital punishment, drugs, the legalization of drugs? Think about it. And then you will ask yourself, what is my culture? So in conclusion, I say that moral relativism is incoherent in my view. And it's also impractical. Even if somehow you believe it's true, I think it would be absurd and an impractical moral view of the world. Well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll see you next time.